What we're going to do this morning, just so you kind of know, I usually talk for about 35 minutes, and then we open it up to question and answers. We have 45 minutes this morning, and if you still have questions about either the presentation or insurance in general, I'm over in the booth for the rest of the day. Come on by and ask any questions that you want. But the presentation is what kind of pilot runs out of gas. And just so you know who I am, I'm Mike Adams. I am an instrument-rated pilot. I've got 30 years in underwriting aviation risk. Avemco is a general aviation insurance company. We've been around for 50 years. I used to tout myself as an expert when I was making these presentations until someone in the audience came up and said, "Well, Mike, you really know the definition of an expert, don't you?" And I said, "Well, it's someone knowledgeable in the field." And he says, "No, you have to break it down to the root words. An X is someone you hear from on the back of your alimony checks, and a spurt is simply a drip under pressure." So I no longer promote myself as an expert, but I do have some knowledge in aviation and insurance underwriting. What we're going to do is I've got 3 scenarios this morning having to do with fuel and trips. This first one is one that I was involved with. Obviously I survived because I'm still here to talk to you. How many of you have flown out in the West Coast, in the Rocky Mountain area, Montana? Okay, we've got 1, 2. All right, so this will be kind of like a travel log for the rest of you because these 3 situations do involve activities out in Oregon, Washington, and Montana. This first one is a trip from Billings, Montana to Hillsboro, Oregon. And on the, got the laser there, we got Billings right there. And pretty much you can pick up a straight line and get all the way into Hillsboro. And from looking at the charts, you can see we've got some high terrain, some hostile terrain to go over. And then as we get in towards Hillsboro, and Hillsboro is down at the end, we come across, we hit the Columbia Gorge, if you've seen any of the pictures there, Multnomah Falls, etc. Then we cross over Portland proper, and Hillsboro's right about there after we negotiate a bunch of communication towers on the West Hills. So as we get closer to Hillsboro, the terrain is a little less hospitable than a little more hospitable than what we went through before. Now, I was flying a 182, so if you pull up the pilot operator's handbook, you can kind of get some specs on a 182. How many of you have got experience in 182s? Okay, quite a few. Long-range tanks, normal tanks? Okay. Well, this one, if we look at the usual tankage on it, or fuel, is 56 usable gallons. Now, the chart, when you get up flight aware and you run from Billings here all the way over to Hillsboro, it's 603 nautical miles. So doing my quick mental calculations, because I'd made the trip several times, that's going to be about 4 hours and 20 minutes, and I roughly calculate that I'm going to burn 12.2 gallons an hour. Doing mental math, I'm not sure I came up with 12.2, but it sounds more believable than about 12 gallons an hour. So if I look at it this way, I'm going to burn about 52 gallons of fuel, and then if I go to my 45% power, I've maybe got 4 gallons left when I get to Hillsboro, which gives me maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And if it's a day VFR flight, all I need to do to be legal is 30 minutes. Correct? Everyone agree with that? Anyone want to do that? Okay. Well, a couple other factors go into this, and it's good that you said no. Because if we take a look at what the pilot operating handbook says at 10,000 feet, and I'll probably be going across at 10.5, or if I want to bump up a little bit, I might go 12.5, depending upon what the winds are. It gives me a range of 565 nautical miles. It gives me plenty of time. I just can't get the distance out of it. So I've got kind of this conflict that we all go through as pilots is, well, gee, the time says I can make it, and we're supposed to calculate fuel burn by time, not distance. So I've got one little thing here in the handbook that says I'll make it. I've got another that says there's no way I'm going to get there. So what to do? Well, you start to look at some other factors on it. So this was at the end of a week-long business trip for me. At the time I had a regional office out in Portland, Oregon, and I had the 5 Pacific Northwest states as my territory. So I'd been traveling, been to a couple of trade shows, so I had my business promotional materials, traveling display. It was lightweight, would fit in the back of the airplane. Week's worth of clothes and an emergency kit. And when I rented the airplane from the flight school, they always made sure that I took off with a half case of oil in the back. And I always thought that it was because the engine was getting, of course, to TBO, and they wanted to make sure I had plenty of oil to keep it running right. Well, they finally admitted to me that, no, Mike, we've watched your landings. You need to have that extra weight in the back so that you have a decent landing. Anyone that's flown a 182 will understand that statement. It really makes a difference to have half a case in the baggage compartment. So that's what I had in the airplane, not overly heavily loaded. So, the calculations are higher is better. We saw how high the terrain was going out of Billings, where you get up over Bozeman, Missoula, Butte, Helena, that area, and then down into Idaho. Winds are generally out of the west in the northwest. There's always that little bit of sightseeing that you're interested in doing because you're going somewhat near Jackson Hole, you're going somewhat near Yellowstone. And then there's always the external pressure. I had made the idiotic statement at the time to the FBO that, yes, I'll be home by noon on Friday. And so the FBO took me at my words, and they scheduled the airplane to go out again with another pilot at 1:30 in the afternoon. And about halfway through my week-long trip, they had called to let me know that the plane had to be back for another 1:30 dispatch. And as a pilot, when we set up goals and objectives with our personalities, we go, no problem, we'll make it. So I had some of that get-there-itis at the end of a long trip. Well, several of the things I learned on the trip is that self-discipline is what's going to keep us all alive. Because I've got that conflict of time says that I'll make the trip, distance in the pilot operating handbook says that I won't make the trip. And which one overrides? I used to work with a fellow from the Air Force Academy out in Colorado, and one of his common sayings was, hope is not a plan. So I had to kind of set that aside and come back and say, what are we going to do? So after I've made this trip, I sat down and I said, okay, I'm always going to land with 1 hour of fuel remaining. I'm not going to get down to the wire ever again. I'm going to stop halfway on any long trip, but I'm not going to go any more than 3 hours. So if I've got a trip that's going to be 8 hours with 2 legs, even 4 hours being the halfway point, I'm going to stop at 3 hours. I just can't go any more than that. The other thing is when you land for gas, you need to get the gas. You can't land, find out that the fuel is out, that it's too expensive, or they're closed for the night, and say, well, I can now make it to the next airport. Because if you could have made it to the next airport, you would have put that in your original flight plan, not your modified flight plan. Plan for the unplannable, and then plan for the effects of altitude, temperature, and turbulence. And when I talk about altitude, temperature, and turbulence, most people jump to the conclusion as, well, how's that going to affect the airplane? And I really don't care how it affects the airplane. I'm more concerned now how those 3 factors affect me as a pilot. So if you're sitting there at 10,500 feet or 12,500 feet for 30 minutes or less, and then you drop back down to your legal, and then you can go back up, that starts to have an effect on your mental thought process, your energy level. Also the temperature. Out there in the summertime, coming back, this was towards the afternoon, so ground temperatures were about 90 at 10,000 feet. We're still about 65 or 70, but then we're sitting behind an engine that's blowing a lot of hot air at us. So even with the vents open, it was fairly warm. And then as you get into turbulence, you combine that with the altitudes, you're breathing thinner air, and you're bouncing around, and it's not like a massage, you just start to get worn out, and again, your mental capacity starts to decrease a little bit. So I start to take a look at those 3 things on any future trips. Now, we all know what the FAR says about fuel. 30 minutes day VFR, 40 minutes at night. You need a little more for instrument rating or instrument flight. Helicopters, we've got that. We've all passed those tests on our written and on our orals and in flight reviews or any wings programs where they would have asked that question. The real question comes up is, how often do we actually adhere to that? How many of you have ever shown up, and you don't have to raise your hand, it's not a truth or consequence thing, have shown up at the airport, and then you've hung around, if it's a rental airplane, to see how much fuel they actually put into it, because you knew you were getting on the margin, but you just didn't know how far the margin was. And occasionally, we've had some of our customers that have called and said, well, I need some non-owned insurance because the FBO is going to make me take a check ride, because when they brought an airplane back after a rental situation, and the lineman comes in and says, you know, out of a 50-gallon capacity, I put in 48.5 gallons. That flight school no longer rents to that pilot unless they've gone through another check ride and kind of reoriented their thought process on fuel. Okay, on the unexpected diversions out here, this is the Pacific Northwest. Right up here, that's the Puget Sound area. Down here is Portland, Oregon, so Hillsboro's right about there. Here's the Interstate 5 corridor. That's going to be Mount Rainier right there, Mount Adams or Helen there, Mount Hood over there, and then the Cascades. But all of this here is kind of cloud cover, and it's not uncommon to have perfectly good VFR days everywhere east of the Cascades and IFR clouds in here. One of the reasons I did pick up an instrument rating was my flying was extremely limited because in the Willamette Valley, which is right along here in the mouth of Portland, Oregon, is we'd get a marine layer that would sit at about 1,000-foot base and the tops would be right around 2,000 feet. Well, you got the Cascade Range to the east of us, the Coast Range to the east. Everything closes out down here. So if you're going to go anywhere at that time of year, you really need to be able to file, get 1,000-foot clearance, and away you go. But if you're a VFR pilot coming back to the West Coast and hoping that the clouds clear out, that doesn't work very often during the spring and summer there. Okay, other unexpected diversions, no fuel and carry cash, or are they empty? I got caught, not on this trip, but at a different time. I had done some flight planning. This was back when we used paper books instead of the internet and the charts. And this book said that this small airfield had fuel for sale on it. And it turned out that it was absolutely correct. It had fuel. The only thing that the book didn't say is that the fuel was provided by the local aerial applicator. As part of the applicator's right to manage the field and run his business out of that field, he had to provide public fuel service, which he did. The way he did it was a cash-only basis. He didn't want to mess with credit cards. He really didn't want anyone coming to his airfield. But here I was. I'd planned for it. I'd shown up. Fortunately, I had enough cash to do a modified flight plan. I was able to buy enough gas there to get to the next field where they'd take a credit card. Because at the time, I was traveling everything on company credit cards. So I found out you always carry cash. And if there's no fuel, wait till you can actually get it or have it brought in to you. Closed runways. Anyway, everyone should remember the haircut incident out here. It doesn't take just a haircut to close an airfield. One of my customers, this is out in Aurora, Oregon, if you ever get out there, managed to close an airport on short notice. And the way he did that is Aurora has a north-south runway. And the winds were out of the south that day, and there were 3 airplanes in the pattern because there's a pretty active flight school there. My customer was in a Piper Arrow, so they were just doing kind of touch and goes. Well, out of the south comes a Cessna 210. And do you all have read Barry Schiff's article he wrote once about you can do straight-ins at uncontrolled airports, it's not illegal? Caused a whole big fear of discussion and stuff. And Barry Schiff is right. It's not illegal to do a straight-in at an uncontrolled airport. It's not smart, but not illegal. So this 210 came in, called a straight-in from the south. So the 3 airplanes that were in the pattern landing to the south scattered out and did a go-around. Now, my aero pilot decided to let the 210 driver know what a faux pas he had created and what a mess he'd made at the airport. So he got up, dialed up the radio, and started chewing on the 210 pilot about we had 3 planes in the pattern, we were landing to the south, you should have listened to the local Unicom, and why are you doing this straight in, and et cetera, et cetera. 210 came in and landed, the 3 airplanes came back, got back into the pattern, the Piper Arrow was number 1, and can anyone guess what happened when he touched down? Didn't have the gear down, absolutely. Well, he was doing his go-around, brought the gear up, got distracted, did the yelling, closed the runway. So now we've got 2 student pilots out on there doing their touch and goes in the solo. Fortunately for the student pilots, there's about 3 other airports within about 15 minutes of Aurora. So they had to either go off and circle till they could get the Arrow off the runway, or they had to go out, get permission to land at a airport, so it's probably the shortest cross country they ever had, and then come back once the airport was opened up. So you do need to have some plans for some short-minute notices as to what can or cannot close an airport, and plan accordingly. So if you've got a lot of airports in the area, yeah, you can start to cut stuff a little bit closer and still make it. Okay, another thing that I found out what comes up is if you're running into some fuel issues, and the minimum fuel isn't discussed all that much, but it's a great thing to use if you're talking to air traffic control. Because you can declare minimum fuel and that has a specific meaning to them, and you'll start to get priorities to whatever you need. And if it gets really dire, you can always call an emergency. The paperwork on an emergency or filling out the FAA is a lot better than, well, we insurance companies are pretty nice, but the paperwork that we have when you lose your airplane because it's a total loss because you couldn't land it at an airfield isn't worth the effort. Go ahead and declare minimum fuel, and you'll get some preferential treatment and hopefully get into an airport. Which brings us up to Avianca Flight 52. Does anyone remember that from back in the day? Okay. If you haven't read through it, it's fairly interesting. It's got a short narration on it. The two things that came out of it is that the findings were they never declared the minimum fuel and never declared an emergency. Well, what goes into the background of this is on the flight into JFK, they had 3 separate holds that totaled 1 hour and 17 minutes. So that airplane was burning up fuel that they hadn't really planned on. They were on their 3rd go-around, and what it really got down to is between the language of the crew, the flight crew, and the air traffic control, flight crew thought that they had declared minimum fuel. The air traffic control hadn't ever heard that, so they proceeded to, you want another approach. Well, ultimately, what should have happened is once Avianca missed the first approach, they should have never tried the additional approaches because no one else had gotten in, and they were already short on fuel at that time. But they did end up having that accident because of the fuel management, unplanned hills, and a little bit of a language issue. But a good read. Now this one for the Pacific Northwest, this is scenario number 2. Incidentally, that 182 with me going from Billings to Hillsboro, I've got to confess it was a little bit of a ruse on the 52 gallons because the 182 I was flying had the long-range tanks. I made it, had plenty of fuel, did it quite often. But had I had the normal tanked 182, I would not have made it. But the pressures to get home were still there. This picture here is Mount St. Helens. It erupted on May 18th, 1980. And Mount St. Helens was an interesting mountain to us pilots in the Pacific Northwest before it erupted. After it erupted, it was like catnip to us. We just couldn't stay away from it. And if we were going to show anyone the wonders of general aviation, it was on a flight up to Mount St. Helens and to look around the caldera and let them enjoy the beauty. So what we have in this one is the normal process was we took off out of Hillsboro, Oregon. I was not the pilot in this one. A personal friend was the pilot. You go up to Mount St. Helens and then you return to Hillsboro. Just in the photo there, in case you're wondering, that's a Piper Warrior wing, not a 182 doing aerobatics. But here is Mount St. Helens. Here's where the caldera blew out. We're looking north, so that's Mount Rainier. And it's kind of winter time there, so we've got a lot of snow in the Cascades, unlike this year where they didn't get any. But anyway, back to this. It's a 182. It's the pilot plus 3 friends. There's about 30 gallons in each tank. It's about 100 nautical miles round trip up and back. And you usually plan about 1 hour and 30-minute flight. And the aircraft was within gross takeoff weight and center of gravity. Now, the way that we usually go is we start at Hillsboro, which is right here. Kind of fly a little bit of a dog leg so we stay out of the way of Portland International, which is right there. Then you head over and Mount St. Helens is right there, and then you return the way back. The reason we do the dog leg is that one, I found out when I took my wife up there the first time, passengers get nervous when they see an airliner coming straight at you, and you're going, no problem, they'll clear us by a lot of feet by the time they get here. And if it's busy, Portland doesn't want you to cut through their airspace anyway, and they'll tell you to stay out. So we just go ahead and plan for the dog leg on that. Now I'm going to leave this picture up of St. Helens as I finish the rest of the story. So what went on with this is the fellow invited the 3 guests. They were employees of his, and it was kind of a treat. They'd been doing exemplar work, and they were interested in aviation. Now, actually, I'll give it away right now. During the pre-flight, one of the passengers showed up. So you can just kind of guess what's going to happen next. During the pre-flight, they showed up when he was checking the left fuel tank. And so he stopped, started over the pre-flight, started to explain everything that was going on, thought he'd put the fuel cap in properly on the 182. And this is one of the flush ones where you have the little knob you turn and try and push down on it. Well, he finished his pre-flight, got everyone in the airplane, they all took off, had a great time, went up, looked around, and on the way back, one of the passengers says, well, I live in Tigard, Oregon. I'll take a quick pop, well, if you can hear. Okay. I live in Tigard, Oregon, which is just right about down here. There's Hillsboro, there's Tigard. And they said, can we go fly over and look at the house? Well, what pilot turns down an invitation like that? So they headed off towards Tigard because the pilot was looking at their fuel consumption. Everything looked real good. Still had almost a half a tank in the left side. He'd been burning out of the right side on there. And the only thing, well, one of the things that made this program work, everyone came out safely, is that any time this pilot got over a populated area, he had a personal minimum that I'm always going to maintain an altitude that if I lose an engine, I can glide to some place where it's open. And with the urban growth boundaries and all around there, there's quite a bit of open farmland right around the Tigard area. So he was maintaining an altitude on there, and all of a sudden the engine did quit, which kind of surprised him because his left tank was still showing, half tank. His right tank was down to fairly empty. He was about ready to switch tanks. So tried the engine restart, that didn't work. Called up air traffic control and said, hey, 182 XYZ, we're over Washington Square, which was a landmark at the time. Out of fuel, emergency landing, we're going to be out here. So that was kind of going well. He briefed his passengers. As far as the public relations of aviation, the downside to this is that he did it in the morning right during drive time. So all of the news stations with their drive time are monitoring, the police scanners and things. And so once he called ATC, it went out to the local police, which immediately got on the drive time. There's a 182 or there's an airplane without any fuel. It's going to crash out there by Washington Square. Got everyone excited. For the pilots, bad luck, at Hillsboro is a FSDO. And of course, they heard about it. So everyone wants a field trip in the local FSDO. So they set out right away to wherever this plane was going to come down. Well, ultimately, he did land in a field. It had just been harvested and cut down. It was a wheat field. Everyone got out. The FAA showed up. The state police showed up. The county sheriff showed up. They all looked around. They called the FBO. The FBO showed up and decided that there was no damage to the airplane. Everything was fine there. And as it turned out, the cause of the fuel loss was this was an airplane that had the old bladder tanks. And apparently the clips had started to wear, and when he was interrupted in the pre-flight, he didn't get the fuel tank on, the fuel cap on properly. It got down close enough that when he did a quick walk around trying to look over the wing, he couldn't see that it was sticking up. So all during the flight, that left tank was being siphoned dry, and there was enough of a vacuum, talking to the maintenance man with the FBO, that it'll actually suck the base of the bladder up against the float. So now you've got constant full half tank because the float is not decreasing as the fuel is being siphoned out. The pilot did say, had he followed his second axiom, which he didn't at that one, he would have still been okay. And with this one, he didn't write down his time and fuel when he checked it. He was all just doing it mentally. He said, had I written it down, I would have realized that I can't have half a tank in the left, still be flying on the right, and be up in the air this long. But every time he looked at it and tried to do his mental calculations, well, normally it's 45 minutes to get up to there, and now we're down and reduced power. And that's why he realized, after the fact, said, that's why I ran out of fuel. Now, what happened to him was the FAA had him take a written test, which he passed. The FBO put fuel in the tank and took off and flew it out. Everyone got a follow-up news story the next day on drive time that no big deal, everyone was fine on it. I don't know if those 3 employees ever flew with them again or not. That's the one thing I haven't followed up on. But there's a thing where someone that had everything right except for the writing down the fuel and checking it and the interruption of the pre-flight had everything dialed in and should not have run out of gas, but did. Okay, last story in our travel log of the Pacific Northwest involves a student solo cross-country. Now, what these are, this is the 3 sisters. They're in the Oregon Cascade. We've got the North Sister, Middle Sister, and South Sister. And these are great landmarks for student pilots on their long cross country. Now in July, up here on the top of the Middle Sister, there's probably a group of Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts because that's one of the high adventure camps out there. And this involves a Cessna 150, and if anyone's curious, I can give you the NTSB report on this one because it did get written up. And here are the facts on a 150. Anyone here got experience in Cessna 150s? Hopefully lots of people. Okay, good. All right. So on the solo cross country, if you look at the fuel burn, we've got 75% power at 7,000 feet. And most of this trip normally is flown at around 8,000 to 10,000 feet because we're going to, when you look on the map here in a minute, we're going to see we're going to go up over the Cascades, we're going to go down the backside, then we're going to pick up that great concrete compass, Interstate 5, which takes us straight back to the home airport. Now if you go up to 10,000 feet, as you can see, you get a longer range and more time. So here's the trip that the student pilot makes. They start out in Hillsboro, Oregon again. They fly a leg to Redmond, Oregon. And the landmarks, the Three Sisters are right down here. We've got Mount Hood right up here. We got Mount Jefferson. So it's pretty easy for the student pilot. You keep a couple mountains on your left wing, you keep a couple mountains on your right wing, and if you still can't find Redmond, which is a pretty big town out there in the eastern Oregon, there's a major highway. So if you hit a major highway, you either turn left or you turn right for a little while until you come to a big city. If you turn left and you go a long way, you hit the Columbia River, which is a pretty good landmark. At that point, you need to declare an emergency and get vectored back home because you're going to run out of fuel. Not many student pilots do that. So the first leg's 109 nautical miles to Redmond. You land. Then you've got another leg down here to Klamath Falls, or Klamath Falls. It's 136 nautical miles. And the briefing normally says when you get down here, you want to buy fuel because you've now gone 245 nautical miles. You've got another 190 nautical miles left. You know you can't make that last 190, so you do need to buy fuel. So the student pilot set off on the cross country, got successfully to Redmond, landed, and it was all set. Anyone want to guess where the student bought fuel? Redmond, exactly. He knew he had to buy fuel, just couldn't remember exactly where. I don't know what kind of notes the student wrote down, but they bought fuel in Redmond. Took off, and now he's flying. He's got the Three Sisters on his right wing. You got the high eastern desert in the left wing. And you come down here to Klamath Falls Lake, which is, a pretty easy landmark. You got Crater Lake over here if you miss that. Excuse me, Crater Lake right there if you miss it. And everything is good. The student starts to get a little bit nervous. He goes, I should have bought fuel. I'm not sure I should have bought it at this place. So he gets out the pilot operating handbook, does the calculations, and says, I've gone 136 nautical miles. I've got 190 nautical miles. I'm flying at about 7,000 feet. So if we think back to if I can get this going right, think back to the page, he goes, okay, I've got enough to get home. So he sets off. Now, I'm going to give some landmarks here, and you can raise your hand as to how far you think the student pilot got before they ran out of fuel. Let's see, notable here at about the halfway mark is Eugene, Oregon. Big major airport there, lots of fuel, lots of flight training and stuff. Then as you work your way a little further up, you get into Corvallis, Oregon over here, another nice airport, lots of fuel there. You got Lebanon over here if you want that. Then you get into Salem and you have Independence. Then if you get up and past Salem, then you've got Chehalis and McMinnville where the Evergreen Museum is, and then a small private airfield, Twin Oaks, and then finally back up to Hillsboro. So, everyone think you got to Eugene at least? Okay. Salem? Okay. Pardon?
Did he know anything about leaning?
Good question. Yes, he did. And we'll get into that here in a bit. He does know about leaning, and he did lean. So we got Salem here. Then we've got about 3 more. Let's see, Aurora, where my aero driver closed the airport's right about there. So there's another airport they could have gone into. So as far as getting someplace, here's about halfway up. That's going to be about Chehalem. And then we've got Hillsboro up here. So how many hands for Chehalem? Okay.
I guess he came up about 10 miles short.
Anyone want to go for Hillsboro? I know the answer. I've read the story. I was there, not the student pilot. Got to Hillsboro. The trouble is, he didn't get to the Hillsboro airport. You're exactly right. He got within about 1.5 miles of the airport, ended up putting it into some trees in a public park. So, big public uproar once again. The FAA, being right there at Hillsborough, had to come out and talk to him. The local government said, well, we're going to start to enforce better flight training. We're never going to have anyone run out of fuel again. And couldn't figure out how they were going to do that, but that's what they said in the newspaper story. Well, now, what I'm going to tell you from here on out for a section is what I heard third hand, so I can't verify it's absolutely correct. But I did rent from the flight school where the student wrecked the airplane, and I knew the instructor. The FAA said, well, we have to go after the student because they did something wrong. So they sat down with the student, and the student did all of the weight and balance, did the leaning, talked about it, knew the carb ice. And the FAA kind of walked away and said, well, yeah, the student knows what they were doing. They did everything exactly right, except for maybe they didn't calculate the winds, but that's a forecast of law. So they couldn't really do much to the students, so they said, well, then we need to do something to the instructor because the instructor didn't do anything, must not have set them off right. So they sat down with the instructor. The instructor said, no, here's my standard briefing on this. This is our flight school standard long-range cross-country for our students. We tell them all, you buy the fuel down here. And yes, here's all the calculations that we go through, and this is the student proved he knew how to do weight and balance, fuel burn, leaning techniques. So the FAA pretty much had to walk away empty-handed. They couldn't do anything to the instructor because the instructor had done everything absolutely correct. And per the pilot operating handbook, had the airplane a new engine, had there not been some light and variable winds aloft on that, the student would have made it and it would have been a non-event. So here again, here's one situation where all of the flight planning, including the 30-minute reserve, said he should have made it, yet he got within 1.5 miles of it. So there's another run out of fuel example when everything he logically said it should have made, he should have made it. So what do we get from all of these? Set some personal minimums and adhere to them, and that's where the ethics come in. If you set personal minimums and then you start to waver on them, or you start to say, well, gee, I landed here, they didn't have fuel, I'm going to go somewhere else, you're not adhering to your ethics. And a sad story on that, and this happened to an FAA employee in Hillsborough. He had a pipe bonanza. He was across the river in Vancouver, Washington for maintenance, and he bases his airplane out of Sandy, Oregon. Washington has some different fuel taxes than does Oregon. Sandy, Oregon has inexpensive fuel. He wanted to fill up once he got back to his home airport, thought he had enough to make it. Unfortunately, he got within 5 miles of the airport, very in hospital terrain, and he died. It was a tragic accident, but it was, again, I've got enough fuel to make it because I'm going to save 20 cents a gallon if I go over here, instead of, why don't you buy 10 gallons to make sure you got an extra reserve on that? So set your ethics and adhere to them. Again, stop for gas. If you plan to get the gas, go ahead and get it. Plan for the unplannable. Then the last is your predicted fuel burn accurate. The 150, in that situation, had it been a new 150, had it been flown by a pro pilot, per the operating handbook, it would have made that final 2 legs on the fuel that it had. But with an engine that at about 1,500 hours operated by a student pilot, it was just burning more, developing less horsepower than it should have. So how do you get predicted fuel burn accurate? Well, if you're on your own airplane, you have the ability to pretty much check it for yourself. Top off the tanks, make sure you've got everything, fly a specific time, top it off again, measure with a dipstick, and then add your margin for error. If you're a runner pilot, I guess you could go out and if you're saying I'm going to take an afternoon and this is the only one airplane I'm going to fly, you can do the same thing. Other than that, just add an extra margin for error on rental aircraft. Okay, last but not least, for those of you that are in the Take the Wings program, we are the company, this is my one infomercial, we are the company that does provide the wings programs, the wings to you once you've got the completion. Once you click that on the Fast Wings thing, yes, I'd like some wings, and you can give my information to Avemco. We go ahead and pull up that out, send it out to you with a nice little letter. And this program does qualify for a knowledge course. So with that, if any of you are traveling and you want to hear this presentation again, here's future locations and places I'll be at. Plus we've hit the Idaho Convention and the AOPA fly-ins and Sun and Fun. We do have some other more insurance-related presentations that one do not qualify for the Wings program. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions. Looks like we have about 5 or 6 minutes left before we need to clear out for the next speaker. I've done such a good job. Oh, good. Thank you. A question.
What are the statistics for like percent of accidents are out of gas? I heard it's really high.
Yes, it is fairly high. I can't give you an exact figure because the FAA will run some things. Our losses that's proprietary underwriting information. It is amazingly high. And a little funny story on this. When initial claim comes in, the first statement on it generally is, was flying unknown loss of engine power. So we assign an adjuster, and pretty soon I get the adjuster's field report, and the first thing the adjuster says is, good news, Mike, you're not going to have any EPA cleanup. There is no fuel to spill into the ground. So now we know why there was a sudden loss of engine power out there. But yeah, you do see it an awful lot. You can almost assume any of the FAA reports that talk about landed short, got within a couple miles of the airport, that's going to be a fuel issue on it. And it is interesting that when we get into claims investigation, how we can go back and determine whether it was a fuel exhaustion, starvation, or a true mechanical problem on it. One of the funny things that came up, and this was a customer out of Montana, he had a Mooney and he had modified the carburetor. It was not the carburetor, but the air filter, and it was an STC modification. And he set off one night out of Butte, Montana, about Christmas time, where it's just colder than heck. And he did lose engine power. He managed to put it down. He came out fine. And this is one of the few times that carb ice has actually been documented. Because what happens most of the time when you have carb ice is the evidence melts. The evidence melts before anyone gets out there. Well, at Christmas time in Butte, Montana, it's too cold for the evidence to melt. And as it turned out, this truly was carb ice. There was a thing with the air filter that did allow a carb ice, prevented the carb heat from coming in and clearing it out. And it was documented because the pilot, he was an FAA fellow, was smart enough that said before they left the plane, he says, well, it's been pretty cold. Let's take a look at the engine and see what they have. So they actually did end up pulling that filter, carb, and the big chunk of ice and stored it in a freezer for further study. It did ultimately end up in a change to that STC and a modification to the air filter to take care of that problem. But that was one where we had a loss of engine power and it was truly documented to be carb ice instead of the alleged. Okay, any other questions, comments? Yeah.
Are there a lot more fuel exhaustion accidents versus fuel starvation accidents, or is it close to even?
Our experience is more exhaustion than starvation. And again, it's that hope is not a plan. They're just trying to stretch it out there. Again, if it's a starvation, again, you can go back and we can prove pretty easily that there was a blockage, a failure of a transfer pump or something like that. Plus, we now have the pollution cleanup that we have to go through because the first responders will report, strong smell of gasoline and things. If they say, well, no, there's no smell of fuel in the area, the tanks were dry, or they get the proverbial, they drained, a half a gallon out of the one tank, and it's a 2-gallon unusable, that they just ran out of fuel. Yeah.
Last June, we did our bucket list flight to Alaska in our garage, and it was a 3.5-week trip. Because of the survival gear and the weight and all that, we were never able to fill the tanks through the course of this 70-hour trip that went up and around Alaska and down the coast and back. And thus we were using the fuel totalizer and the meticulous amounts of fuel going in, going out, fudge factor. We landed at Flying Cloud and thought we had 12 gallons. We had 4.
Wow.
We didn't have enough to go around. And so I make a comment only because if you're doing something where you never get to fill the tanks for that length of time, figure something else out. And we did not have a dip at that time. We were just going by what went in and what didn't go in. Now we have a dip rather than eyeballing the tabs.
Yeah.
But that was an eye-opener, and I just share that so nobody else does that.
A very good point. And from an insurance point of view, we get inquiries quite often that, well, I put in a fuel totalizer, or I got, an engine analyzer, and do I get a, insurance premium credit or discount because I'm never going to run out of fuel, etc. And unfortunately, the answer is it's nice that you have that. It's nice you're not going to have an accident. But no, we don't have the statistics to support any kind of a credit. And your example is exactly it. If someone is buying partial fuel at some point, you're starting to introduce that error that unless you do a full fuel or a dipstick type thing, you're just working with your same error. Stay in the back, then we'll take yours.
I was going to add that, I think some pilots are reluctant to declare an emergency or a low fuel state because they're afraid of what the FAA might say or do. And what the regulation says, if you read the regulation carefully, it says you must plan for X amount of fuel after you reach your destination. It doesn't say you have to arrive with that much fuel. It says you have to plan for that much fuel. So really the FAA has no reason. You did proper fuel planning in the first place, and the wind velocity are higher than forecasted, or for whatever reason you actually have less fuel than you planned at your destination. The FAA doesn't have the case.
Correct. Yeah.
I think it's really important to not, as you said, not be afraid to declare.
Emergency, right, yeah. Minimum fuel would be the way to go on it. And then you had a question here.
Stats on the difference between claims with avgas and autogas?
Okay, the question is, do we have any stats on any claims involving avgas versus auto fuel? We haven't seen any appreciable difference on it at all. The one or two things that we've noticed, and this has been from talking to our customers, not the result of a claim, is that occasionally there'll be a bit of a fuel vapor lock problem. We had one on actually that Warrior, that 151 wing you saw in the Mount St. Helens picture, had a fuel lock issue on it because when they went to the auto fuel STC, there was a heat shield on the fuel pump that should have been removed. It was not during the initial installation, and so on ground operations on hot days, they did get a fuel lock. And I know that because that plane was my father-in-law's, and I was in it when the engine coughed. Get your attention right away.
Overall, what's the highest percentage of claims that DEMCO sees in a given year? What kind of accidents or what kind of incidents?
Despite what the NTSB says, the 4 things we have to work on, without fail, with numbing consistency, it's landings. And it's not necessarily mechanical failure. In fact, that's one of the presentations I'll be doing at Sun and Fun. The majority of our claims are basically loss of directional control. And so if we can all start to either make better decisions on crosswinds, learn how to land in crosswinds, learn how to flare, etc., you can save a lot of money on insurance premium because we'd be able to about halve our rates. The other ones, as far as mechanical issues and things, really aren't that much. One thing that's kind of interesting out here, and you can't really do anything about it, is birds, mooses, and gunshots give us a fair number of claims every year. And this has to do with either hunters, or in one case where we had a ugly divorce going on, and the spouse that was the non-flyer went out and shot up the soon-to-be X's and flyer's airplane. It's a covered loss because the soon-to-be X was not a policyholder because intended acts are generally excluded from coverage in an insurance policy by the policyholder. Had she been a co-owner of the airplane, which she was not, it would have been excluded under insurance because it's intentionally destroying your own property. But it was only in his name, and so she's a legal third party, and we paid for a lot of bullet hole repair. The plane was salvaged, by the way. Okay, and you had another question.
I just wanted to point out, especially with that one with the 150 where he theoretically planned correctly, I notice a lot of fuelers don't fuel right to the top. And when you have a half-inch down, it doesn't look like a lot, but when the tank's this wide and you have another one on the other side, you can knock yourself easily out of 30 to 50 an hour's worth of fuel if you're trying to stretch your fuel. And I think a lot of inexperienced pilots may not put the extra gas in and put it right to the top of the wing. It's a huge difference. Yep.
Also, having a good point on that. Also, how level are your wings? Again, if you fly a 182 or a 172 and you fill up the tanks, then you park on a sloping ramp and you don't switch the fuel selector to off, pretty soon you notice that the low wing, if it's got the vent, there's a big wet spot when you come back, and you don't have much fuel left in your high wing. So you just filled up, went and had lunch, and now you're taking off with about 5 or 6 gallons less than you thought you had. So you do need to be careful of that. Anyone here fly the Diamond DA40 on there? They've got, I've just a little bit of experience with that. They've got a unique way to check the fuel that's very accurate. It's basically a tube, and they have a gauge that you put on the wing and hold it at a certain location, and then it's a pressure. So you don't get to look in the tank and try and guess how far down the tank wall the fuel is. You've got an exact reading right there. It's different than everyone else, and it's unusual to get... Oh, wait a minute. This may be a while, and it's unusual to get used to, but once you think through it, it's an extremely accurate fuel measurement. But it takes a while to say, well, I'm not actually looking at fuel in the tank, but here's an external gauge that is more accurate than my eyeball looking at the corner of the tank. So a good thing to know on that. Okay, and with that, I'll end the questions. Again, I'll be over in the booth inside. We'll get set up for the next presentation here. And any questions, feel free to stop by, give us a call, and thank you for coming out this morning.